The Sting of Mortality. Chapter 3. The Blood Moon. Oftentimes, as Clove trekked through the forest, he paused and turned to look behind him, or glanced up to search the sky for the dragoness. As much as he dreaded the thought of running into her, he would lie if he didn't slightly miss the mysterious woman. But he knew better than to fantasize on such things. Their relationship started off badly and ended badly. He doubted things would change, at least not for the better. One thing was for certain: he would always look at things differently, and perhaps tread a little more carefully, especially when it came to magic. The Clove had never trusted magic, but now he wanted nothing to do with it at all. His father had been all too right to stay clear of it. He had lost his father's sword, and was now trudging through the forest with nothing but rags on his back and his worn-out boots and an empty stomach. 2 long, dreadful days passed. The Clove had managed to curb his appetite finding berries and roots, but as far as hunting went, he had little luck, and after a while the poor diet was beginning to make him sick. He stumbled across a rather large road and grinned. At last he was getting somewhere. Spirits high, he briskly picked up his pace. The sun was finally shining down on him. As the Clove marched on the dusty road, he felt the wind change directions, bringing a strange smell blasting him from the west. Miles down the road, he heard a great roaring sound way off in the distance. Intrigued, he ventured forward until he came to the clearing in the trees, to a large grassy plain that dropped off down into a shimmering, crystal green, never-ending ocean. The Clove stopped in his tracks and stood in silent awe as he took in the wondrous view and breathed in the crisp, fresh sea air as the waves crashed against the sand and jagged rocks below. The Clove had heard many stories of terrible storms and giant sea monsters swallowing ships whole. However, he had never thought it would be this beautiful. At that moment, he didn't think there could be a more peaceful place in the world. Soon, the initial shock and awe turned into overwhelming curiosity. It didn't take long before the Clove was able to find a way down from the high cliffs to the beach below. Once he was past the rocks, the Clove kicked off his tattered boots and ran his bare feet through the sand and spun around in wonder and laughed like he had never laughed before. "This is amazing!" he shouted. All his troubles seemed to pass away as his feet splashed into the cool water. That was until a large wave seemingly came up from nowhere and sent him somersaulting backwards, which might have been a pleasant experience had he not drunk too much of the seawater. A lesson the young adventurer learnt the hard way. The Clove came up out of the water, hacking and spluttering his way back onto the wet sand. The seawater burned his eyes and sinuses and wrenched his empty stomach. "I hate this place," the Clove cursed between dry heaves. Once he managed to regain his bearings, the Clove stood up and continued wandering down the beach, hoping to find a suitable place to make camp when he noticed a small flash of light shining in the sand. The Clove gasped when he saw the opalescent seashell shimmering in the sun. He looked again to realize that there were dozens laying around, scattered everywhere. His yellow eyes quickly scanned around to see if anybody else was nearby, and he began hurriedly shoveling them into his pockets. Many tribes, and especially his, used these as currency, along with shiny beads and precious stones and mirrors. "I am rich! Damn it, I am filthy rich! I can buy a ship with this," he shouted. All thoughts of settling down and making camp, or even finding food, completely evaporated. Once his pockets were fit to burst from the seashells, the Clove rushed to a large dead tree stump that had been washed ashore and bleached white from the sun. Using the white stump as a marker, he began digging a large hole in the sand, which he used to bury the rest of his treasure. It was hard work, but he was certain it would pay off eventually. When the sun began to set, the Clove started gathering driftwood to make a campfire next to the large tree stump, only to find later he had lost both his lighter and flint in the water. The Clove cursed under his breath. He could get a fire going without flint or lighter, but it would take time, and after hours of collecting and burying a heap of seashells, he was ready just to sleep. Eventually, he did get the fire going, and let out a relieved sigh as he leaned back against the tree stump and watched the sun's brilliant rays that reflected off the waves, consuming the small clouds and red flames of its radiance as it slowly sank beneath the ocean. The Clove sighed and took a deep breath of cool, crisp, fresh, salty air. He felt at peace and was happier than he had been in a very long time. The Clove leaned back to gaze up at the bright stars as they began to appear in the sky, listening to the waves crash against the beach. Just as he was certain all his troubles were behind him, he felt something running up his pant leg. The Clove frowned and sat up to find, to his horror, the tide had risen. "Oh no, I just got the fire going," the Clove shouted. But the waves didn't listen, and the hot embers hissed and steamed noisily as the next wave crashed into the base of the campfire. "Blood and gall!" he cursed as he hurriedly began salvaging the remaining hot embers from the rising tide. Despite burning his fingers, the Clove was able to manage to juggle a flaming stick from hand to hand to preserve one of the hot embers. Finally, out of reach from the ocean's waters, sopping wet and covered in sand, the Clove sat down and began quickly to rebuild the campfire, this time out of reach of the tide. It was then he paused. It felt like there was someone or something staring at him. He could almost make out their eyes in the shadows. With his presence already known, it was no good trying to hide. The least he could do was be able to see them coming and have some sort of barrier to keep his back in case of trouble. The Clove sprang to his feet when he saw a tall, thin man dressed in a black silk suit step out of the darkness and appear a mere 10 feet in front of him, with a large picnic basket in hand. The man's thin lips parted as he whispered a faint "Hello." The Clove glanced down at the unique, ornamented silver hilt of his sword, and then suspiciously at the picnic basket, and then returned the man in black a hard stare and slight nod that conveyed a deeper acknowledgment than words ever could. "There's nothing like a fire to warm the blood," the pale creature commented as he propped himself beside a large round boulder and tilted his head, studying Le Clove curiously with his pitch-black eyes. "Are you cold?" Le Clove asked, but there was no sympathy in his voice. The pale-faced man's lips twisted into a devious grin, revealing two thin fangs protruding from his upper lip. "Do you know what I am?" he asked mischievously. The Clove frowned and crossed his arms over his chest, unimpressed. "Most decent folk aren't out at this time of night," he replied. The vampire smiled again. "No, they aren't," he agreed, and leaned forward so that the fire cast large shadows over his pointed features. "And what is a strange creature like you doing alone out here at this hour?" he asked. "Only the lost, the desperate, the foolish, the mad, and the wolves are out during this time of night," Le Clove replied somberly. "And what may you be?" inquired the vampire. "Perhaps a little bit of everything," Le Clove responded coolly. The vampire's eyes sparkled with silent laughter as he set down his picnic basket and spread a small blanket over the sand. "Are you hungry?" he asked as he began to set large hunks of fine cheeses, a fresh loaf of bread still warm, a flask of wine, plates, and wine goblets for two. The Clove's eyes narrowed with distrust, but then he smiled back, showing off his own, albeit less threatening, but nonetheless tenacious white grin. "Do you know what I am?" he asked, as he stooped down and grabbed the heavy green wine bottle. The vampire paused and laughed again. "And what are you, then?" he asked curiously. Le Clove laughed again as he thoughtfully poked a stick into the fire. "I think you're afraid," he mused out loud. The vampire's smile faded. He tilted his head to the side, and his gaze hardened. "I could have killed you at any moment I wished," he replied. "But you didn't, because you were afraid," Le Clove interjected calmly. The vampire blinked and let out a slow, agitated sigh. "Only curious. And it is tradition to allow the victim to have a final meal before they die," he announced coolly. "Do you know what happened to the cat?" Le Clove asked. The vampire laughed. "I am not a cat," Please try the wine. I hear it eases the pain. He gestured toward the bottle in the drifter's hand. Le Clove smashed the bottom of the green bottle over a large rock and held it up, glistening sharp and jagged in a menacing gesture. The vampire methodically rose up from his resting place. I want you to know I'm going to enjoy killing you, whatever you are. He laughed until he was suddenly cut off by a wave of hot embers and sand that came springing up into his face. The vampire shrieked in blind pain and agony as the bright, hot embers burnt his pale face. Before the creature could recover, the Clove leapt over the campfire and thrust the broken glass bottle through the vampire's throat. The vampire gasped and gurgled on his own blood, but when he instinctively reached to push his attacker away, he found it to be a mistake. In an instant, the Clove ruthlessly shattered his elbow and dislocated his shoulder out of socket. Satisfied and confident that the vampire was not going to be any more trouble, he quickly confiscated his sword and shoved the broken creature to the ground and let him drown in his own blood. It was then the young warrior heard a peculiar popping sound, but it was not from the fire. It came from behind him. Le Clove quickly drew the finely crafted saber from its scabbard and spun around, ready, he thought, for anything. But he was wrong. When he saw the vampire slowly stagger to its feet, his blood ran cold, and watched in wonder as the creature's bones began popping back into place. The vampire's head twisted and turned to glare at him with the gleaming, pitch-black, hungry eyes. Faster than Le Clove could blink, the vampire closed the gap between them in a matter of milliseconds, slapped the flat of the blade to the side and seized him by the throat, and caught Le Clove's wrist before he could ram his sword through his abdomen. Le Clove cried out in terror as he struggled to pull away from the vampire's awesome, superhuman grip, but he could not break it. All Le Clove could see was the vampire's glistening fangs coming to rip out his throat. His gaze went to the vampire's black eyes in horror as the creature effortlessly overpowered his sword arm. With no other option left, Le Clove cursed as he savagely kicked the vampire in the groin. The vampire swore in agony as Le Clove wrenched his sword arm free from his grasp and cleanly severed the vampire's arm that held his throat. Once he was free, he quickly used the blade and hacked at its skull until the vampire finally collapsed to the ground in a mangled, bloodied, unconscious heap. Albeit the vampire's severed hand was still very much active and still would not release him. The Clove cursed as he frantically began prying away the vampire's pale, bony fingers, one by one. He swore again and hurled the severed arm at the vampire's corpse. "Let's see you grow that back," he cursed and paused to catch his breath before he sat back down by his large pile of firewood. He intended to keep the fire burning throughout the night. The encounter had been close, too close. The clove groaned inwardly when he heard the unwholesome and unforgettable sound of wriggling tendons and severed nubs stretching out to form 5 bony fingers that began to grow out of the mangled stump of its arm. In an instant, the vampire sprang back to his feet. Firelight gleamed in its ebony black eyes as he gazed back at the yellow-eyed warrior. The vampire smirked as he stooped down to carelessly toss its own detached, severed arm into the flames like a piece of firewood. "You hurt me," the vampire remarked in annoyance, as he wiped the blood and gray brain matter from his face. The clove gasped in astonishment. The vampire didn't even bear a scar. He had fought many foes, but none like this. No matter what he did, he couldn't seem to kill it. It would not die. The vampire just kept coming. "Well, I suggest you leave now, unless you enjoy pain," he warned, doing his best to appear excited about the prospect, but in reality, he hoped that the vampire would not take him up on the gruesome challenge. No sooner had he spoken, the vampire leapt over the campfire and tackled him. The vampire grinned. "But I do," he laughed. "Good," the clove cursed, driving his sword into his soft belly as the vampire pinned his back to the ground. The infuriated vampire seized the clove by his scalp and let out an evil hiss as he watched the tendons in the young warrior's neck flex and strain as he struggled to keep him from exposing the vital arteries in his throat. Just before the vampire was about to sink his fangs into his neck and feast on his blood, the clove coiled his legs beneath him like a spring and sent the vampire catapulting off of him through the air. The vampire clutched his stomach in pain. "Hold still," he hissed angrily. The clove laughed. "Why don't you just shut up and die?" he cursed. The vampire snarled angrily and leapt at him, but the clove was ready this time and swiftly bashed the creature across the face with a hot stick from the campfire. The vampire cried out in blind agony as it staggered backwards, clutching his scourged face. He felt sick as he watched the vampire's blistered skin begin to heal. "Stay back," the clove warned. "You can't kill me, mortal," growled the vampire. The clove thrust the burning stick at his face. The vampire hissed as he shielded his sensitive eyes from the firelight and quickly backed away. "No, but I'll hack you into 100 pieces," the clove warned, keeping on guard. The vampire's fangs glistened as he circled around the fringes of darkness and chuckled insanely. "Fool, you're already dead. You just don't know it yet." "Ha ha! Unless you have friends out there, I might just die laughing," the clove shot back and laughed at his own joke. The clove didn't know much about vampires. but he knew better than to chase a nocturnal predator in the dark. He kicked the vampire's basket of bread and cheeses. No matter how hungry he was, he would eat nothing that the creature had been offering. "I would not sleep if I were you," the vampire hissed, as it slowly began to back away, slipping into the dark to find another victim, and was seen no more. The clove stayed on guard, listening. After some time he grew wary, but he hardened himself. He gripped his sword hilt firmly, needing something to focus on. The clove's attention drifted down to the bloodied sword in his hand and remembered the sword's code. Never mend a broken blade lest it break twice, and never keep the blades of the fallen, lest you meet the same fate of its master, he told himself out loud, and then a faint grin came to form over his dry lips, when he realized that the tragic irony of it all was the vampire was still, unfortunately, very much alive. The clove held up the bloodied sword and studied the small inscription on the hilt. "Sangra Luna," he remarked, and nodded somberly, noting the curved crescent moon on the pommel of the sword that ended in a sharp, reinforced tip. "A good blade. A fine blade. Now you serve me," he declared, and sat down, cross-legged, using a rag to clean the blade as he waited for the sun to return. Up next, Chapter 4, A Stack of Coffins. I'm having fun. I hope you're having fun. If you stuck around, consider, clicking on the channel, and it's free to follow. And there's going to be a lot more books, a lot of different types of books. I'll probably stick with fantasy fiction, maybe dabble in some sci-fi. We'll see where it goes.